Hello and welcome to another episode of That Praise Song. My name is Paul and I'll be walking you through songs that have been sung throughout the church in recent times. This time round, we're looking at a song written by Phil Wickham, Battle Belongs. Let's begin. Now, the song Battle Belongs is essentially a message of surrender to God amidst overwhelming trials, especially in times when we are tempted first to take things into our own hands. Phil Wickham leaves no room to doubt whenever he says in the chorus that when he fights on his knees with his hands lifted high to God because the battle belongs to him. Essentially, the gist of the song is that of a man or a woman or a person who fails to see that actually God is in control all along. And that's why we find in this song a beautiful dynamic of how the perspective of a person who is overwhelmed by worry, by fear, by struggle is juxtaposed with the realization throughout the chorus that it is actually God's battle and that it is already won. Right now, we are going to look at how Scripture actually informs this key message of the song, Battle Belongs. We're going to look at Scripture first and foremost to understand this key message that is found in the song, Battle Belongs, in the book of Daniel. Let's have a look. In Daniel chapter 2, we see essentially a similar situation, but one that was experienced in the real life of exile. Let me just give you a bit of a background to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel and his fellow kin had been taken off into a foreign land, into Babylon. This was during the time when King Nebuchadnezzar, the tyrant king, had come and had taken over, had flattened the kingdom of Judah. And Daniel was exiled, taken away from his family, taken away to a foreign land to serve this king. Nevertheless, we see in the book of Daniel, and particularly in Daniel 2, that in the midst of being away from home, in the midst of being placed in a foreign land that was hostile to his own well-being, he thrived, not because he had strength, but because he had faith in a God who is almighty. As I break down this narrative for you, we will find that there are so many similarities to the message of the song that we find in Battle Belongs. Well, firstly, we need to recognize that in the context of Daniel 2, it all came along when this rather insecure, this rather unsettled king, though his kingdom was expanding, the kingdom of Babylon back then, he had received a vision of which he could not understand. And because in those days, if you did not understand a vision, especially if you were a king, it meant that the gods were not on your side. It meant that you did not have access to revelation. And therefore, he summoned his high priest, he summoned all of his wise men, and he said to them, challenged them, tell me my dream. He didn't ask them to interpret the dream, he asked them to tell him what he dreamt. That is quite a crazy request, isn't it? But it was because he felt insecure. He felt that these men were out to get him politically. And so he gave them an impossible task. And because they could not decipher nor even explain the dream, he had them ordered to be put to death. And by this time in Daniel 2, Daniel and his friends were also part of this guild of wise men. And they were all going to face execution imminently. It is in this phase of such threat, such overwhelming threat, not only to the guild of wise men, but even to Daniel himself, an exile who had no idea that this was going to happen to him, and faced with this imminent execution. What does he do? Scripture tells us very clearly that Daniel was not one to take things into his own hands. Let me read to you in Daniel chapter 2, verses 12. It says, because the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed, the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? And then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And what did Daniel do? In verse 16 it says, Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. But that's not all. It says later on in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And then in verse 19 it says, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in the vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. I find this to be a very compelling message. We live in times whereby whenever we are faced with a problem, we always start with us, isn't it? What can I do? What is within my capacity? What is within my network of influence? What can I do to make things better immediately? With Daniel, you find that in the face of an imminent threat, and we're not just talking about something in regards to his status or his financial well-being. No, it was his very life. It was about to be snuffed out along with the other guild of wise men. And yet Daniel did not panic. Daniel actually went on his knees to pray together with his friends in his home. And we see this beautiful narrative whereby when you call on your knees to God and you pray, even with imminent threat, we find here that Daniel's testimony and that of his friends is that God answers his prayer. And this prayer that has been answered actually becomes a point not only of revelation to that crazy king, that tyrant, that insecure king, but as it says further on in scripture, Daniel tells this king later in verse 30, he says, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have, more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your mind. I'm not sure if you caught that, isn't it? Whilst we may be thinking that, oh, our prayers are just for our well-being, so that we will get out of that rut, we will be taken out of that well. But we find that Daniel here says to this king, who himself was the main threat, the main antagonist who wanted to kill everyone, he says that, I have received this revelation from God so that I may minister to you. He says that specifically, so that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Daniel knew full well, not only that God was the one who would fight his battles, but he knew full well that the will of God is so big that it's not only for his own benefit, not only for the survival of the other pagan wise men who were not Jews, but also in order to minister to this tyrant king. Does that not surprise you? I think it does. I think it surprises me to know that this is how great our God is in regards to his plans. And this, my friends, becomes the lens to understanding even Phil Wickham's song on how God fights our battles. So now that I have shared from Daniel 2, we want to see how these insights actually echo themselves into Phil Wickham's song, Battle Belongs. Well, let's begin obviously with the chorus, isn't it? Phil Wickham says, when I fight, I'll fight on my knees, with my hands lifted high. Now that is essentially a posture of prayer, a posture of surrender. And that is exactly what Daniel and his three companions did, isn't it, in Daniel 2? Faced with the imminent threat of death, they went straight to God. But that's not all. We see that even before the chorus, for the first stanza, even the second stanza, Phil Wickham actually puts himself in a rather vulnerable situation, because he always says it of his perspective in regards to trials and tribulation in a rather frail way. He says, when all I see is the battle, you see my victory. When all I see is the mountain, you see a mountain moved. So do you see that juxtaposition immediately? Even in the first stanza, he says that when I feel overwhelmed, all I see is negative. But then God sees an opening. God sees positive. God sees a light shining through that darkness. This is actually repeated again in the second stanza when he says, when all I see are the ashes, you see the beauty. And then he ends with one more illustration. He says, when all I see is a cross. Now in this case, he uses the cross to illustrate death, to illustrate condemnation and judgment. He goes on to say, when all I see is a cross, God, you see the empty tomb. He points beyond the crucifixion to the hope of the resurrection. And that is actually something which the book of Daniel chapter 2 brings witness to. Daniel chapter 2 bears witness to how God is a God of hope. how God is a God of light in the midst of such imminent darkness and threat. Phil Wickham leaves no stone unturned when he describes the different aspects of our sufferings and tribulations and feeling overwhelmed. But he doesn't leave us there. He points us always. It's his constant refrain, whether it's in the verses or even the chorus, even the bridge right now, because his refrain is this. When he compares it with Daniel 2, he says in the bridge, "Almighty fortress, you go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadow, you win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God." Now, I'm going to read a passage in Daniel 2 of Daniel's thanksgiving prayer in response to the revelation given to him, and you will actually see that something is being echoed similarly here. This is what Daniel says after receiving the vision of revelation that saves him and the guild of wise men and even ministers unto that tyrant king Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel answers in verse 20, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you." Did you catch that? That's similar to this echo in the bridge of Phil Wickham, that God is indeed trustworthy. God is not only almighty, but he is trustworthy. He comes through. And I just want to echo what these two sources are saying in our life today, isn't it? That when we talk about battles in our lives, it could be in areas of our mental well-being, it could be in areas of our emotional lack of peace, it could be in regards to our communities, in the workplace, in church even. But we are always called and reminded, not only through this song, but as this song echoes these principles of scripture seen in the life of Daniel, that the battle truly belongs to God. We are not called to be passive, but we are called to actively surrender to God. For he fights our battles. We do not take things into our own hands. And I pray that this message will be a clarion call for all of us, not just on Sundays, but especially in the weekdays when things get tough. So I hope this message blesses you. So if you've enjoyed what you've seen, do encourage us by subscribing to our channel, turning on the notification bell, and by leaving us a comment down below. We'd love to hear your own reflections in response to our exposition from Daniel 2 and the message of Phil Wickham in his song, Battle Belongs. In the next episode, you will see Ivan, Chris and myself giving you our own rendition of the song, Battle Belongs. So do look out for that one. Finally, do check out the videos that are popping out on your screen right now, on the left and on the right. Take care.
When all I see is the bad.